and opposition that is going to unfold over the next few years is going to unfold in this context of center-state relations around center-state finances. We saw it beginning in the discussions around the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission. The 15th Finance Commission report is going to be tabled very shortly. And it's going to be interesting to see, one can't second guess where the Finance Commission is going to go, but I think the political tussle that had unfolded last year around the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission is only going to get more and more sharper over the next few years, and we are likely to see a very interesting and important push and pull between centre and states, particularly the opposition-led southern states, over the next 5 years, which I think is going to lay the course for the architecture of India's federal system over the next 5 years. And there, I think, is where the political theatre is going to move forward. So to close, what we are likely to see, I think, certainly from a political perspective, is a lot more status quo, in the sense that I don't see any new changes in the architecture of the welfare structure. You're going to see is perhaps some necessitated by the fiscal situation, a quiet rollback of subsidies, but it will always be quiet. I think anyone that is hoping for significant changes in India's subsidy regime should just lay that to rest and hope that incremental changes will eventually lead us where we want. I don't, even though I sincerely believe that we should, see the possibility of any significant investments in increased investments in human capital, as you say. But what I do see is a clear consensus across party lines on a compensatory architecture of welfare for India. And that's going to be the narrative that will consistently go to the polls. Whether the Indian voter is going to vote only for welfare, compensatory welfare, and not for economic growth is a question that we'll come to 5 years from now. Thank you.
Educated population, and we smoothen the transitions between those. We smoothen the transition from school to college to the workforce, and we allow and enable investments in human capital by individuals. Unless we do that, I don't think they're going to improve productivity the way we have managed to so far, and grow the way we have managed to so far. And we need to stop. And as commentators, I think we need to stop arguing for spending on one slice of this human capital rather than the other, right? So these are not substitutes. So the fact is that we don't have to stop at 3% of investment. There are ways to finance education in other ways. So we don't have to look at the fact that we have 3% and that 3% of budget needs of the GDP needs to be spent in one way or the other. So the moment the allocation to higher education increases, we start talking about school education. And the moment the expenditure of school education goes up, we start complaining about higher education. I think that needs to stop. These are complementary investments that need to take place together. And finally, I think that we need to start thinking about improving the average productivity of the workforce in India. Because and I'm going to end with this, because all comparisons that we make and we talk about how great our education programs are, which allow us to compete, as I said, which allow us to compete professionally in the West, we are comparing our best to the American average. That's how we are competitive compared to most other countries. That's not a fair comparison. Right? And so I'm going to stop with that, and thanks.
So from the discussion so far, the takeaways that I seem to have drawn is that the binding constraint for India seems to be the delivery and the policy thinking and strategizing mechanisms. And strangely enough, the Indian economic left and the Indian economic right are not really thinking differently. And the consensus on reforms that we had thought we had achieved in 1991 is now weakening, and the right is behaving like the left. So why is the political economy behaving like this, and what can be done about it? Yami Iyer, if you could enlighten us.
Thank you, Pooja. First of all, on behalf of all five of us, actually, a very, very warm welcome to you to this annual discussion, and look forward to many more years of this. You asked, my task for today is to take you away from all the many, many complicated PowerPoints with many, many graphs and lots of numbers, all of which, like our finance minister said, are available on the website for further review, at the end of which you can certainly go back to all of them and ask them deep questions about their numbers. But you don't need to bother with me on that, because I will take you away from the numbers and do what our finance minister did, which is talk more about the politics and the political context in which the budget was placed. And I think that's important precisely for the reason, Pooja, that you mentioned, because it frames and shapes the context in which decisions are made and budgets are set. In this case, the obvious place where everybody would begin when thinking about the political context of this budget is this government's resounding mandate. There was absolutely no one in this room, and I can see many journalists here, who had perhaps predicted this government will come back, but may not be with a majority, or just perhaps a majority. Many had predicted that it wouldn't come back, it would get about 200, 220. We got 303. And just like everybody who was surprised at the 303, we quickly turned around and said, this means that we can expect something that would really shake up the status quo. So all the commentary in advance of the budget talked about the opportunity that this government has. And of course, all the commentary, including my own, I must confess, says on budget day, this was an opportunity lost. It gave us a nice headline, but it's useful to ask ourselves why we thought this was an opportunity lost. Because a lot of what we've seen in the last 5 years of this government should remind us that this government tends to be far more incrementalist, tends to be far more status quoist than many would have thought. And therefore, rather than looking at this budget from the perspective of what would this resounding mandate do to really address the deeper structural constraints that the Indian economy is confronting, many of which have been talked about by speakers before, it's useful to try and understand what is it about the narrative of the mandate that has shaped this budget and likely is going to shape the way the government is going to go forward over the next few years. There are many reasons why voters vote, and there are many reasons, therefore, why governments come back to power or get voted out of power. I don't attempt here to offer a theory, but I think if you could piece together a lot of what we've understood, at least from the narrative of the government itself and its own leaders, two things seem to stand out quite significantly. On the one hand, there was a narrative of a country with a leadership that is strong, that is working hard to provide for this country a secure nation, that is working hard to move this country towards its ambitions of becoming a global superpower, that was showing its muscle on the global stage. And on the other, there was a narrative of a government that is focusing very carefully on welfare of its poorest citizens. The medley of schemes that the government put in place from about 2016 onwards was front and center in at least the analysis of how the election was won post May 23rd. So there were these two aspects of what the government was, what the BJP went to its people with. And in many ways, exactly these two narratives are very visible in the budget. The $5 trillion economy, which if you ask questions of, you are a professional pessimist, was very much front and center of how the budget was framed. And interestingly, for the first time in the last 2-3 years that I have read budget speeches carefully, you see a shift because usually the budget speeches would begin with talking about the Kisan. This time the budget speech began with talking about the $5 trillion economy and moved on about half an hour later to talk about Gaon, Garib and Kisan. So expectedly, you see these two stories sitting together. But embedded in here, I think, is a recognition, implicit recognition, that the ambition of a $5 trillion economy is now going to look very different. It is not going to be an ambition of a $5 trillion economy that is built up on an economy that is providing jobs and strengthening human capital. It is going to be built on an economy and a statist welfare structure that is going to provide private goods for public citizens. That has been the narrative of the welfare orientation of this government for the last 3 or 4 years. It is what Ratin has been writing about quite often. This a government that is moving away from being a developmental state towards a government that is increasingly becoming a compensatory state. And in here, I think, is a quiet admission that the 2014 imagination that Narendra Modi, and I'm saying Narendra Modi because I do believe that the BJP and the RSS have got multiple internal contradictions in how it views its economic policy, ones that could perhaps be open for a different conversation and a different debate. But the notion that you will have an economy that functions very much on the idea of a maximum government, maximum governance, minimum government, an economy that is going to be built on empowerment of the poor, not entitlements of the poor, has now been firmly laid to rest. This is about a welfare structure that is going to be the core foundation of this 5 trillion economy that is very much about direct provisioning of private goods to public citizens. And you will see in the last 3 years, regardless of Ayushman Bharat, financial allocations for things like health and education have been stagnant and in fact dropped somewhat. So this is not necessarily going to be the core of the base and foundation on which this economy is going to be built. More importantly, if you look carefully at the narrative of this election, a lot has been talked about these welfare schemes as being critical in hindsight, I must add, because I don't recall reading so much about these welfare schemes in the run-up to the elections, and I certainly don't recall much being spoken about these welfare schemes in rallies and speeches given by the leadership of the BJP. But nonetheless, these welfare schemes are very much central to the narrative of what is it that convinced the voter, at least for the time being, to give a resounding mandate to this government. It's important to look at not so much the question of whether or not these schemes were the right thing or whether or not these schemes were effective in achieving their objectives. Again, a discussion for a different debate. It's important to look at how these schemes were unfolded and how they fit into this narrative of a $5 trillion economy and a country with a strong leadership that is taking along its people to achieving this $5 trillion economy. One important thing, all of these welfare schemes have very carefully been crafted to certainly give the voter the impression that these schemes are a direct connection between the Prime Minister and the leadership in New Delhi and the voter sitting far away from the state capital. Schemes renamed as Prime Minister, not unusual in India's political landscape. We've had multiple schemes in the names of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi and so on. But just that coming together of all schemes being renamed as Prime Minister is important. Linked to the use of technology and the use of direct benefit transfers to, in many ways, cut through layers of the state. Of course, there are questions of what this can do to improve the efficiency of public service delivery. But from a political point of view, not from a policy point of view, what this does achieve is a very direct link, literally from the Prime Minister's coffers into the bank accounts of individual citizens, building this notion of a strong government, a leadership that cares for its people, a leadership that is directly in connect and contact with its people. And this is best achieved when you implement schemes that are about private goods provisioning, that are direct to home, which is going to be the new mantra here for the next few years, rather than schemes like education or emphasis on investments in education and health, which tend to be far more diffused. Enabled, of course, by the fact that there had been significant political alignment between the center and the state for the bulk of the 5 years of this government, which again allowed for a lot more direct connection, direct communication between New Delhi and the implementation of these schemes, furthering that story of a government where welfare schemes was very much about the persona of its leadership and the persona of this government. Therefore, it is unlikely that you will see a welfare architecture being developed that is going to look any different over these next 5 years from this compensatory welfare architecture, moving moving closer towards that developmental welfare architecture that Ratin talks about, or rather a welfare architecture that is going to start investing far more in the foundations of health and education that are necessary, I believe, to genuinely move in the direction of a $5 trillion economy. Not to argue against a large, strong social protection system, which I fundamentally believe in, but what you are going to see, which I think is necessary for a strong social protection system, is a fundamental reform of the architecture of that social protection system. Right now you have a whole new set of programs with enhanced allocations that have been added on to this medley of schemes that already exist. So you can have PM Kisan, and you can have MSPs and fertilizer subsidies and chemical subsidies and electricity subsidies all sitting neatly together, expanding that basket of subsidies for the government without much effort to move towards the question of what is the core architecture of our welfare structure that we need in order to be able to achieve the ends of a $5 trillion economy. And I'm stressing on welfare only because from the perspective of the political narrative, I believe that that plays a very critical role in creating the foundation of what we are going to see for the next 5 years. It's also important, I think, here to point